Hello, everyone. My name is Nicole Vagel, and I work in the Office of Human Resources on campus employee well-being. And in the replacement of the annual wellness symposium that we usually have every year during this time, we moved things virtually and extended our offerings over the course of October to be 31 days of community well-being. So I really hope that you've been able to take advantage of some of the other resources, some pre-recorded talks, some reflections, some actions, small actions throughout the month via our virtual calendar. And I'd also like to extend a very big and warm thank you to our OHR conferences team for making this month happen, and then also to our partners in Department of Family Medicine and Community Health, as well as our engagement, inclusion, and diversity partners within OHR who have helped us curate this content this week and this month. So today's session will be recorded. I'm sure you all got a little notification of that. We are doing that so we can allow folks who weren't able to join during this time to listen to the session afterwards on their own time. And then today is our first day of live sessions. So we are very happy to welcome Dr. Kathleen McCraw with us today to help us learn more about healthy sleep and relaxation. So Kathleen, I'll hand it over to you.
Just unmuting myself there. I think everyone should be able to see my presentation and hear me. Thank you all so much for coming today. Just a little bit of background information before we get started. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work at UW Health West Clinic, and I spend a lot of my time talking to people about anxiety and depression and stress. And I particularly love talking about sleep because it's such an important part, not only of those, kinds of therapy related things that I talk about, but just because sleep is so important for all of us. And it's really rewarding to talk to people about changes in sleep because it's something that we know people can make minor changes, and when they're consistent with them, they can result in some really positive improvements in sleep. So that's why I'm talking about sleep today. So again, a little more information. Why sleep? This applies to everyone, right? Every single one of us here today, we all need to sleep, and it's an important part of both our physical and our mental health. Most of us face pressures to sleep less. They've done studies on this, and people are consistently getting less and less sleep over time. And there are lots of things that could be contributing to this. Work, school, things people are having to do at home, social pressure when people say, gosh, I only slept 3 hours last night. How about you? And technology, technology keeps us from sleeping, or we feel like we have to be on all the time and respond to things. So all of these things we know are interfering with our sleep. And relevant particularly today, sleep is impacted during COVID for a lot of people. And I would say it's not just COVID right now. I think a lot of people are also having difficulty sleeping because of other things going on in the world. Politics, the upcoming election, I know, is causing a lot of people some distress with their sleep. And so I think this is a particularly timely presentation to be talking about sleep. All right, so my hope today is to talk about kind of a variety of topics. First, before we can really talk about how to improve sleep, I want to talk a little bit about what sleep kind of looks like, the biology of sleep and relaxation. I'd like to talk about what happens when we don't get sleep. And then from there, we'll move into talking a little bit about how to improve your sleep and also some ways to feel more relaxed. All right. So my hope is that everyone here can come away from this with maybe at least one or two possible changes they can make to improve their sleep. I think some of these you may think, I've heard these before, but I'm also trying to go into why we make these recommendations, because I think it's a lot easier to follow through with them if we know why they're recommended. All right, so first of all, and I will try not to get too into the weeds here with the biology stuff, I promise, but I'll say it's important to think not just about the time we spend asleep, but about the whole sleep-wake cycle, because what we do throughout this cycle can affect the amount and the quality of our sleep that we get. So long story short, we have a lot of processes in our bodies that are based on biological rhythms of various lengths. So this would include things like menstrual cycles, breathing, heartbeats. Sleep is just one of these. If you've ever heard people call this their circadian rhythm, what that really means is that it's a process that happens every 24 hours. And the part of our brain that is really in charge of this sleep-wake cycle is our hypothalamus. It's that little tiny purple area on the slide there. It's really pretty small, but it's part of what we call our limbic system. And what our hypothalamus does is it controls a whole bunch of our automatic body processes: sleep, hunger, thirst, heart rate, blood pressure, temperature. Kind of the main function of the hypothalamus is to maintain our body's like homeostasis. And part of that is the sleep-wake cycle. All right, why do we sleep? This is a really good question that I get asked a lot, but honestly, no one's really sure. There's been a lot of research on this, and there's no strong consensus, but some of the things people have come up with is that it's really important for the maintenance of our physical health. So some ideas behind this might be that it helps restore our body functions that we might wear down during the day. It might help us kind of develop, kind of structures in our brain or our body, particularly as we're younger. And we also know that it can help with our cognitive functioning. It may help maintain and build that. So it can help with things like memory, concentration, alertness. So even though there's really not a strong consensus on why we sleep, what we do know is that it is necessary because prolonged periods without sleep can be fatal. And I don't say this to be an alarmist. It's incredibly, incredibly rare, but we know that that's something that we absolutely need to live. All right, so first question. Let's talk, as we're talking into what we consider to be fairly normal sleep. The amount of sleep that we need changes over the lifespan, and I'm curious to know what the people here think. If Nicole, you can put up that poll. Which age group generally needs the least amount of sleep? There we go. All right. So we've got a few people saying children and adolescents, a couple people saying younger adults, and the majority of you are exactly right. It is older adults who need the least sleep. So if we're thinking about what sleep looks like for kind of the average person, any of us who have spent time with newborns and infants know that they spend a ton of time sleeping. So when we first start out in life, we might sleep for like 14 to 17 hours a day. And then slowly over time, we sleep less and less and less until we get to older adults who may need only 7 or 8 hours of sleep per night. The way sleep is structured also changes over the course of our lifespan, and I'm not going to get too much into that, but generally, the sleep of a newborn is going to look a little bit different than the sleep of an older adult in terms of kind of the sleep cycles, which I'm going to talk about here as well. Oops, sorry about that. All right, so sleep cycles, let's talk a little bit about this. Over the course of the night, we go in and out of different stages of sleep. And so we have 4 stages of what we call non-REM sleep or NREM sleep, which get progressively deeper with slower brain waves, and 4 is the deepest. So if you look at this chart here, the very bottom is the deepest level of sleep. There are kind of 4 stages of that non-REM sleep. And then we have REM sleep, which some of you may have heard of. What happens during REM sleep is we have increased brain activity and eye movement. That's why it's called REM sleep. It stands for rapid eye movement. And it's very similar to what our brain's doing when it's awake. And this is the period of time where we dream, and our body is actually immobilized during this time. Excuse me. So our muscles are kind of paralyzed to keep us from acting out some of those things, all of that activity that's going in and out of our brain. So one cycle of going in and out of all of the stages takes about 90 minutes. And in order for our sleep to be good and restorative, we want to go through each of these sleep cycles multiple times because each of these serves different functions. So if we're thinking about, some of the deeper sleep may lead to that more, more recovery of our, physical body. Some of the lighter ones may be a little bit more related to memory. We want to go in and out of these stages of sleep. However, as the night goes on, you can see if you look at this graph, that sleep usually gets less deep and we have more lighter stage sleep. So earlier in the night, we have more deeper sleep. Later in the night, it tends to get a little bit lighter. All right. And I have a good question here. I see about a question about what do we consider to be an older adult? Going back to this, I believe that the study looking at this was ages 65 and up. Good question, Patty. All right. So let's talk about what a normal night of sleep looks like. Obviously there's no standard that applies to everybody, but these are some of the things that we might want to be looking for to determine if we're getting good sleep. So first of all, we generally want to be falling asleep within about 15 to 20 minutes after turning off our lights and actually trying to go to sleep. Another thing to know, and I think this is a surprise to some people, is that it is actually normal to wake up at night. It's not necessarily a sign of bad sleep if you are sometimes waking up. It's pretty normal to wake up about 2 to 3 times per night. Just something you want to pay attention to is whether or not you're able to fall back asleep relatively quickly. Again, within about that 15 to 20 minute time frame, we consider that to be pretty normal. And as I said, for a healthy adult, 7 to 9 total hours of sleep tends to be about what people need. But of course, this can vary based on, individual needs, health statuses, things like that. All right. So I'm having trouble getting to the next slide. There we go. So what happens when we don't sleep? Well, we know that lots of bad things happen when we don't sleep, both in the short term and in the long term. So first of all, we know that people have decreased emotion regulation, which is their ability to kind of monitor and control their own emotional responses. So if you think of like a small kid who hasn't gotten enough sleep and they throw a tantrum, we may not throw tantrums as adults, but honestly, we have the same lack of ability to kind of control how we're feeling and how we act. We also know that people's cognitive performances are not very good when they start losing sleep. So things like attention and reaction time, formation of memory, executive functions. Executive functions are what we call sort of higher level thinking. And this is stuff like decision making and planning, self-control, creative thinking, switching back and forth between tasks. We are just not as good at these things when we haven't gotten enough sleep. And so I think this was a really interesting study. They were looking at what sleep deprivation did to people, and what they found was that for people who got just 6 hours of sleep per night for 2 weeks straight, so just a little bit less than what we might consider to be kind of a normal amount of sleep, people who got 2 weeks of 6 hours a night consistently, they had the same level of cognitive impairment as people who hadn't slept for 2 days straight. So really not sleeping well consistently can really start to kind of knock back your ability to think clearly and calmly. And I think another interesting piece of this was that they were also asked to rate how sleepy they were. And participants showed that they actually were not aware of how tired they were. They rated themselves as being, I think, kind of moderately sleepy to maybe not sleepy at all. So there wasn't a very good awareness to this. We're not always clear ourselves on when we're not getting good enough sleep and the effects that it might be having on us. Of course, if we're not getting enough sleep, we might also have these things called micro sleeps, which are basically just very short periods of time where we can fall asleep kind of out of nowhere. This can last for a fraction of a second up to like 30 seconds. And this is really dangerous because this can cause car accidents when people are doing something higher risk, working, in a factory or something like that. It can cause significant errors. And so we know that that's something that happens with sleep deprivation. All right. So some longer term effects of sleep deprivation. We know that it works against your immune system. You're more likely to get sick. And we also know that it comes with increased risks of weight gain, dementia, diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, mood concerns, things like that. So really, it's in our best interest to try and get the best sleep that we can. All right. So I promised I would talk about how we can get to better sleep. We've talked a lot about kind of the various things the body does to regulate sleep. When we just focus on those pieces, sometimes it's easy to assume that this is a really automatic process that we have limited control over. But the good news is that our bodies are actually really responsive to various changes we can make, behavioral changes mostly, that help uphold or shape a normal sleep-wake cycle. And I'd like to talk about a number of these behaviors that can be helpful for sleep, but also talk about why they're helpful. All right, so the first tip that I can give you is to develop a really good nighttime routine. So if anyone here has ever taken an intro to psychology course or learned about Pavlov's dogs, you're probably familiar with classical conditioning, and that's the reason behind this and several of my other first sleep tips. And so the short rundown of classical conditioning is that Pavlov, he was a physiologist many years ago who was doing research on dog salivation. And he noticed that, his dogs would drool when they were being fed, as dogs will. And then he realized that they were starting to drool when they heard the footsteps of the people who fed them. So he started doing this experiment where he said, well, if I start making a noise, let's say I sound a bell right before feeding them, I wonder what will happen. And over time, the dogs developed what we call a conditioned response, where they would drool at the sound of a bell, even if there was no food involved. And so this is what we call classical conditioning. You start to get a response, a conditioned response to something that you might not have responded to before, in this case, the bell. So, as unflattering as the comparison to drooling dogs might sound, this actually works really well on humans too. And so in this case, let's think of the bell as any specific set of behaviors that you do before bed, like some of the things I've listed here. This could be reading for 30 minutes. It could be, kind of nighttime hygiene stuff like washing your face and brushing your teeth or showering. It could be listening to a podcast. It could be basically anything that's relaxing. And something that you're able to do regularly. So we'll think of that as the bell. And the dog food is the stuff in our environment and body that usually makes us tired. So things like darkness and decreased temperature. And the dog's drooling is us falling asleep, okay? So if we regularly carry out a nighttime routine right before we go to bed and fall asleep, what happens is that we'll eventually develop a conditioned response. I apologize, I keep hitting the wrong key. There we go. We'll develop a conditioned response where just doing our nighttime routine will signal to our body that it's time to sleep, and just doing it will start to make us tired. So this is particularly helpful for helping us get good sleep if there are things that are making us kind of alert or stressed, which I will also talk about, or if our sleep schedules have gotten knocked off of our schedule a little bit. This can also be really good for shift workers who may need some extra help kind of signaling to their body that it's time to go to bed because they may be going to sleep at times of the day where it's not dark. But something important to know about this is that you can't just suddenly start doing this and expect it to work. You have to do this consistently in order to develop this response. So I highly recommend that everyone have just kind of a set of behaviors that they just do every night before they go to bed. I have known people who have developed kind of a conditioned response to something really specific, like listening to the same song every night before they go to bed. But it doesn't have to be that specific, as long as it's something that you can do regularly that starts to signal to your body that it's time to wind down. All right, next question. So here's another poll. Can you compensate for sleep loss by sleeping more on the weekends? I know this is something a lot of us are prone to doing. All right, so it looks like most of you are thinking that no, you cannot. So this is actually what I thought for a while too. And I ended up looking into this more as I was getting ready for this presentation. The answer is actually kind of maybe. Again, there's not a great consensus on this. This is something that's been researched a lot. but it seems like it can help offset some of the negative effects of sleep deprivation. So if you really didn't sleep well during the week, you can sleep a little bit later during the weekend, and that might help you kind of rest and recharge a little bit more, but it probably won't bring you back to the same level that you'd like to be at. And related to conditioning, there's a really good reason to not do this. So if we not only have a regular nighttime routine, but we also keep ourselves to a regular sleep-wake schedule, our body starts to become conditioned to a regular and timely sleep routine. So let's say that on the weekends, you get up around 6:30 to go to work, but on the weekends, you sleep in until about 8:30. So that means that sometimes you're getting up before the sun rises, and sometimes you're getting up afterwards. And when you have this variety in your schedule, your body doesn't have the chance to develop any sort of conditioning where it learns that the sun coming up means that it's time to be, awake and alert and get out of bed. And similarly, if there's a lot of variety in what time you fall asleep, your body isn't going to learn what's a reasonable time to start winding down. So if you don't have this regular schedule, it's much easier to get thrown off by an all-nighter or a poor night's sleep. But if we have a regular sleep schedule, our body can slip back into things more easily if we have some of those exceptions. So one thing to note here is we can't always control exactly when we fall asleep, of course. We can't always will ourselves into doing that. But we can control what time we get out of bed. And so one of the best ways to try and maintain a regular sleep schedule is to try and get up at the same time every day. And the only exception to that really is if you're so tired that you can't function safely. You have to get up and drive somewhere and you're thinking, if I don't get some extra sleep, I'm not safe on the road. You should get that sleep. But otherwise, if you can get up at the same time every day, that'll really go a long way in helping with your sleep. All right. Another question. So if you can't fall asleep within that 15 to 20 minutes we were talking about earlier, which of the options below do we think is the best strategy to deal with that? All right. Yes, you guys are on it here. So we're kind of split between get out of bed and go to a different room and stay in bed and think about something calming. So you guys are right. The majority picked get out of bed and go to a different room. I'll talk about why some of these other ones are not great options, but first let's talk about why I would recommend that you get out of bed and go do something else. So as I said, if you can't fall asleep after about 15 to 20 minutes, I recommend you get up and you go do something relaxing, preferably in a different room. And then don't go back to bed until you're actually sleepy, not just tired, but like sleepy. Your eyes are starting to close and you're thinking, if I sit here any longer, I may just pass out. So sleep is better when we develop a conditioned response between laying in bed and being asleep. So if we stay in bed when we can't sleep, especially if we're having regular trouble sleeping, we might start to develop a conditioned response. Again, this is going back to the conditioning between bed and discomfort. So we want laying in bed to equal that nice nap that guy's taking or that nice night of sleep. And we don't want it to remind you of things like being awake and alert and maybe a little bit anxious or watching the clock. Related to this, there's kind of a daytime component of this, and this is to make sure that you don't spend a lot of time in your bed or preferably even your bedroom when it's not time for you to be sleeping. So you don't want to form an association between your bed and studying, reading, watching TV, eating. Any daytime activities like that, they should be done somewhere else so your body doesn't think it's time for one of those when you crawl into bed at night. All right. So let's talk about why it's good to avoid naps. Again, I think this is one that a lot of people have heard, but I want to talk a little bit about why we recommend this. So all of us have what is called a sleep drive, or sometimes you'll see this called sleep pressure, like in my graph here. And this is basically how much our body wants to fall asleep. So it starts rising when we get up, and it goes up throughout the day, and we fall asleep easily at a certain threshold, which is kind of that dotted line at the top of my graph. Napping can really mess this up. So let's say you have these two people that I have in the graph here. Person one gets up at 7 a.m. and they're the blue line there, and their sleep pressure, their sleep drive increases until about 10 p.m. And then maybe they have a really good nighttime routine they use, and then they fall asleep. Their sleep drive decreases while they're sleeping, and then it kind of bottoms out, and they naturally wake up between about 6 and 7 to get ready for work. However, person two, the red line there, they get up at the same time as person one. They take a nap around 2 p.m. They're not tired enough to go to sleep until 3 a.m. because, as you can see, as they nap, that sleep drive goes down. And then it has to build back up, and they don't hit that until long after they want to be in bed that night. And then the other thing that happens is that their sleep drive isn't low enough. It's not restored enough to get up between 6 and 7 when they might otherwise have wanted to. So it's really good to avoid naps if you can. Again, the exception to this would be is if you're so tired that you can't be safe without taking a nap, then you want to take a nap. You always want to be safe if you're driving or doing anything like that. But if you can, avoid the naps. All right. And I think I'm going to go back to a question that I saw in here. Give me just a moment. So I had a question here about my last tip. So what if getting up when you're sleepy to go to bed wakes you up enough that you're no longer sleepy? So sometimes this can take a little bit of time to get used to. And I think it's something that you want to do in conjunction with these other sleep tips. So it probably will make you feel a little bit more awake. But if you're going to be awake anyway, I would rather people be awake outside of their bed so they're not developing that conditioned response. And so ideally, you want to do something really relaxing and calming. You want to stay away from screens, which we'll talk about here in just a second. You want to stay away from, eating or drinking, reading, meditating, things like that are a really good thing to do to try and bring down that alertness if getting up has made you a little bit more awake. That's a good question. All right. So screens, I mentioned the hypothalamus before and how it helps regulate our sleep cycle. And one way it knows to do this is by gauging how much ambient light there is. So there's this little piece of our hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Excuse me, I'm having trouble pronouncing it. We call it the SCN most of the time. And what it does is it gauges how much light is coming in. And when there's a sufficient amount of light coming in, it tells our brain, hey, it's daytime. It's time to be awake and alert and get out of bed and be active, which works really well a lot of the time. But the problem is that a lot of screens also activate this. So TVs, computers, tablets, phones, things like that, they activate that part of your hypothalamus, the SCN, that tells your body that it's daytime. And so when you use them as you're trying to fall asleep, it can make you more alert. And so they've done studies on this. Nighttime screen use is linked with shorter duration of sleep, poor sleep quality, things like that. Something that I also learned as I was getting ready for this presentation, a lot of you may be aware that, Apple has something called night shift, and I think other devices have similar things where it makes your screen warmer in the evening, so you're not getting so much blue light. And what I found is that these can help minimize the impact of the screen light on your sleep, but it doesn't mitigate the effects entirely. So honestly, if you're having trouble sleeping, I would stay away from the screens at least an hour before going to bed. All right. Another question. How many hours before bed should we try and avoid caffeine? What are your thoughts on this? As I drink my tea. 6 hours, all right. We got a few 4 hours, a few 8 hours, but most of you think 6 hours. You are correct. There we go. Yeah, 6 hours. So there have been, of course, studies on this. And I think one of the most interesting ones was a study where they took all the participants and they compared a group that had a moderate amount of caffeine, either 0, 3, or 6 hours before bedtime, compared to people who had no caffeine at all. And in comparison to the group that had no caffeine at all, they had a placebo pill, so they didn't know they weren't getting caffeine. Even the 6-hour group, so well before they were getting ready to go to bed, they had less overall sleep, more wakefulness when they were actually asleep. They would wake up more easily. And they had less non-REM sleep. So they had less of that deep restorative sleep that we know that people need to really get a good night's sleep. Of course, there is individual variability in caffeine sensitivity. You know, some people can drink caffeine right before bed and they're okay. Some people need to stop well earlier than 6 hours. But what I found in talking to people about this is that many people aren't aware of how far in advance of bedtime you generally need to stop caffeine. Right. So other things to avoid: alcohol and nicotine. So alcohol is one of those interesting things where when I talk to people about this in the context of sleep, people will often say, well, alcohol makes me sleepy, which is true. It can be a sedative. It can help you fall asleep more quickly. But what we also know is that as it wears off, it actually acts more as a stimulant. So, you know, if maybe you've had a lot to drink or you've had a moderate amount to drink in the first place, as that's wearing off, it's going to cause wakefulness and lighter sleep. And so you won't see yourself going in and out of those sleep cycles that we really want to be seeing. The other reason to avoid alcohol, honestly, is because it makes people need to get up and use the bathroom at night. So if you're having any kind of drink, even if it's just water, you just want to be mindful of how much you're drinking, because needing to get up and use the bathroom will disrupt your sleep. Nicotine, you will also want to avoid. It's a stimulant, you know. So again, I've heard people say, well, if I get up and I can't sleep, I'll have a cigarette. I would really recommend that people stay away from that. And something that we know is that smokers are found to have more daytime sleepiness. They sleep less amount of time overall, and we're not seeing them go in and out of those cycles of sleep or those stages of sleep the way that we know helps people feel rested and restored. All right. Environment stuff. So we've talked about some of the behavioral changes that you can make related to sleep, but also some of it boils down to, like, what is the room that you're sleeping in like? Some things to pay attention to. First of all, you want it to be quiet or noise-free. Again, we all have different sensitivities to these things, but things to think about. If for some reason your environment is too loud, things I would recommend, you know, earplugs, a white noise machine, a fan. Those can be really helpful for people sensitive to sound. If your room isn't dark enough, blackout curtains or an eye mask can really be helpful. You want it to be comfortable, and this is based completely on personal preference, right? But you want to think about, like, are my pillows comfortable? Is my mattress the right firmness? Are my blankets warm and comfortable for me? You want it to be safe, and I recognize that not everyone feels safe in their homes, and so if that's something that's interfering with your sleep, you know, something we might recommend would be like burglar bars or an alarm system or other security measures that help you feel a little bit safer as you're trying to go to sleep. This last one I always feel bad about. I am a pet owner myself, and it can be lovely to, like, cuddle with your pet, but if you're having trouble sleeping, I would really recommend that you do not let your pet sleep in your bed. They can move around a lot. They can kind of walk all over you, or they can make noise. And so I really recommend that you spend some time with them at night, you have a nice bonding activity with them, but then have them sleep outside of your bedroom and definitely not on your bed. All right. Another question. What do we think is the best bedroom temperature for sleep? If you had to guess what's recommended for good sleep, what are your thoughts on this? Got kind of several ranges here. All right. So most people are saying somewhere around 65 degrees, some a little lower, some a little higher. This was a little bit of a cheat because there are kind of two answers here, because it's a range. So what we're looking at is somewhere between 60 and 67 degrees. They've done a lot of studies on this, and people tend to sleep the best when the ambient temperature of the room that they're in is between about 60 and 67 degrees Fahrenheit. And so one of the reasons that this works so well is that it helps reduce your core body temperature, which is a signal to your brain and your body that it's time for you to fall asleep. It's one of the things that your body starts to naturally do as it becomes bedtime, is that it cools you down. And so if your room is helping cool you down, it's more likely to make you sleepy. And, of course, again, there's some individual kind of preference in terms of what people like of, the temperature in their sleep environments. But one thing they have found, if you're not quite sure where you want to put the temperature, err on the slightly colder side, because bedrooms that are too warm or too humid, they're more likely to make us wake up in the middle of the night due to discomfort than bedrooms that are too cold. All right. Exercise. So this is another one that I get a lot of questions about when I'm talking to people about sleep. They're like, should I try and tire myself out? Should I avoid exercise? And the answer is it's kind of a balance. So regular exercise is associated with better sleep, but you don't want to do it too late in the day. Because again, if we go back to that idea of core body temperature, as you work out, the temperature of your body goes up, which tells your body it's time to be awake and alert. And it can also be activating because it releases endorphins. And so if you do it later in the day, you may be a little too alert and awake to fall asleep at night. But you do want to make sure that you're getting regular exercise, because we do know that that can help with sleep. So kind of the time frame that we're looking at, again, there's some individual variability here, but for about 30 to 120 minutes before bed, you want to avoid working out. Eating. Okay. So you want to be mindful of what you eat and when you eat. So this is another one where it's kind of a balance. You want to avoid heavy meals before bed. It can lead to indigestion. It can lead to less restful sleep. The same would go for anything really greasy. But you also don't want to go to bed hungry. I'm sure all of us have at some point gone to bed hungry and then not been able to fall asleep, or we've woken up because we're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm really hungry and I wish I'd eaten something. So if you feel like you're too hungry to fall asleep, what you would want to eat would be small snacks before bed. Carbohydrate heavy snacks tend to be the best. And of course, there are some people who have health conditions like diabetes who may have different rules about what they need to eat and when. But in general, you want to just kind of have this balance of not eating too heavy of a meal before bed, but also not going to bed hungry. All right. So the next kind of bigger section here is talking about how to be calmer at night. So a lot of people have trouble falling asleep because, their minds are really busy. They can't stop thinking about things. Maybe they're worried about things. Maybe their mood isn't great. And also sometimes people are like, well, my mood's okay, but really I'm just feeling very wide awake and activated and alert. My heart's maybe kind of beating kind of quickly, and I just feel very alert. Again, the good news is that there are a lot of strategies to help address these, and we'll talk about some of them. Let's talk for a minute about why this affects our sleep, though. So we're going to back up and talk a little bit more about biology here. So the part of our nervous system called the autonomic nervous system is in charge of all of those automatic processes that your body does: breathing, heart rate, temperature. This may sound familiar because it's also a lot of the same stuff that your hypothalamus does. So our autonomic nervous system is broken into these two parts. We have the parasympathetic nervous system, which we sometimes call the rest and digest system. And it's associated with a lot of the stuff that we know goes along with good sleep: decreased heart rate, slower breathing, overall feeling more calm and relaxed. And then the opposite of that is our sympathetic nervous system. And it activates us so that when there's a threat, we can take care of it. So if you've ever heard fight or flight, this is the part of our body that's in charge of that. And so again, it does the opposite of the parasympathetic nervous system. It speeds up our breathing, it speeds up our heart rate, it makes us alert and active so that we can deal with anything that might be a threat in our environment. And the problem is that the system tends to activate when we're feeling anxious or stressed or worried. It's not always when there's a big emergency. Sometimes it's more minor stuff, and this alarm system will just kind of go off and keep us from being able to sleep. So these two systems tend to work the opposite of each other, so that when our sympathetic nervous system is activated, it's suppressing all of those nice and calming and relaxing parasympathetic responses. So even though these are automatic processes, there are some things that we can do to kind of override them and boost our parasympathetic response and kind of inhibit that sympathetic response. And we'll talk about some of those. So the first one here is diaphragmatic breathing. And I actually want us to take a few minutes and practice this. It's a nice thing to kind of, practice doing in the moment, I think. So this is an exercise that we know encourages a parasympathetic or a rest and relaxation response. So when our sympathetic response is dominant, we're often breathing in too quickly or too shallowly. We're getting in too much oxygen, we're not breathing out enough carbon dioxide, and this can enhance these feelings of alertness or anxiety. So diaphragmatic breathing is a way to elicit this higher parasympathetic response by consciously slowing down our breathing. And I want to walk you through this a little bit for a few minutes. So there are three big things to pay attention to. The first one is that you want to practice breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. So again, with this idea of not wanting to get in too much air because we're not breathing out enough maybe, we want to just we want to limit the amount of air going in. And so the reason then that we want to breathe in through our nose is that we can only get so much air that way, right? If we breathe in through our mouth, we can go and we can get too much air, but when we breathe in through our nose, it's naturally limited. So breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. Another piece of this, and this is the reason we call it diaphragmatic breathing, is to do what we call belly breathing. So go ahead. I don't think we can see any of you except for me, so I'll demonstrate for you, and you guys can try this yourselves. If you put one hand on your chest and one hand on your stomach, you want to try and breathe, control your breathing using your diaphragm muscle, which is this muscle kind of in your torso here beneath your lungs. And when we control our breathing using that muscle, it helps slow the breathing coming in. And you'll know you're doing this if when you put a hand on your belly and a hand on your chest, the hand on your belly is moving more than the hand on your chest. So I'll give everyone a few minutes to try that. So just as you breathe in, see if you can move that hand on your belly in and out. And so you may notice this may not feel very intuitive to you. This is not how most of us breathe by default, and we need to practice this to slow ourselves down. The other piece of this is to breathe as slowly and as steadily as possible. So what I usually tell people, there aren't any magic numbers for this, but you might want to try by breathing in for 5 seconds, holding for about 2 seconds, out for 5 seconds, and holding for about 2 seconds. So in for 5, hold for 2, out for 5, hold for 2. And we'll practice this. I'll walk you through about maybe 3 or 4 breaths of this. Let's try 3. But something to know is if you're doing this along with me and it makes you dizzy or lightheaded or anxious, this may not be the exercise for you. Just stop doing it. But everyone else, I'd like you to just kind of try and follow along and see how this goes for you. So you can go ahead and put a hand on your chest and a hand on your stomach. And I'm going to walk you through 3 full breaths of this diaphragmatic breathing using that 5-2 counting. So in, 2, 3, 4, 5, hold, 2, out, 2, 3, 4, 5, hold, 2. In, 2, 3, 4, 5, hold, 2, out, 2, 3, 4, 5, hold, 2. Last one, in, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hold, 2, out, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hold, 2. Okay. So that's 3 breaths consistent with diaphragmatic breathing. I welcome any notes in the chat here about what that was like for you, or as we're talking at the end of the session, I'm happy to hear about that. But this is a really good thing to practice, to slow down your breathing and get it to be a little bit deeper if you're feeling awake and alert at night. You know, sometimes people will lay in bed and do this for 5 to 10 minutes. Maybe it's part of their nighttime routine that they do to signal to their body that it's time to wind down and go to bed. And so also, you may see on these slides, I have some links to some videos for some of these, or some resources for some of these. And I know you can't click on these, but I believe these will be posted in the chat if they're not there already, so that you can have like a video that will walk you through this and you don't have to remember it. All right. Another way to try and be a little bit more relaxed at night is to practice something called progressive muscle relaxation. So when we're stressed or we're anxious, we're often also really tense. And sometimes we don't even realize it. So it's not that we're all walking around doing this all the time. We just have kind of a more moderate level of tension that we don't even notice is happening, but it's inhibiting our ability to relax. So another way to practice this relaxation is an exercise called progressive muscle relaxation. And it's specifically geared towards helping you reduce your muscle tension. And the way that this is practiced is that you go through the muscle groups in your body one by one. You might start at your head and your face, and then move down your neck, your shoulders, arms, torso, legs. And you tense all of your muscles one by one for about 5 seconds, and then you relax them and you just let them drop. And I really like this because it not only helps us know what relaxation feels like, so we're better at knowing when we're tense and noticing that, but it also gives us an exercise to feel more relaxed. This is another one that can be really good to do as part of your nighttime routine. There's some people who do this nightly as they're getting ready to go to bed. The goal of this exercise is to basically feel like a cooked noodle afterwards. You want to be just as relaxed as possible. And while we don't have time to practice it today in this session, I do have a link to a video that will walk you through it. One thing I would just caution people of is that if you have any areas of your body that are prone to pain, skip them when doing this exercise. You don't want to overstrain anything or hurt yourself. So listen to your body. Don't tense anything that's going to cause you longer-term pain. Mindfulness meditation. I'm aware that there was a presentation on this already, which unfortunately I couldn't attend. But the goal of mindfulness meditation is not necessarily to become relaxed, but I include it here because I think that it's something that often causes people to feel nice and relaxed. The very act of redirecting your attention to the present moment can be calming, and a lot of the exercises are relaxing. So the leaves on the stream meditation is a really common one that if you practice meditation, you may have heard of. And again, I have a link to that if you want to follow through and listen to a video on that. But it's good for helping people just kind of unstick from thoughts. So if you're having trouble sleeping because you're thinking of stuff that you're worried about that might happen in the future, or you're stuck on stuff that happened in the past, practicing a meditation like this can help kind of bring your mind away from those things and focus a little bit more on the present moment. And I often say, we've talked about getting out of bed if you can't sleep. Practicing mindfulness is a really good thing to do if you're trying to find something to do during that time. And I'm sure many of you are aware there are lots of apps and audio tracks for this, and I have some links to those in the notes for the presentation. One of the really good ones I recommend, partially because it's free and partially because it comes from UW, is the Healthy Minds app. It's a really good one I would recommend checking out. And it has, I think all of these apps have a good combination of mindfulness activities with other rest and relaxation sorts of exercises. All right. So something else, if people are feeling alert and worried at nighttime, one of the ways to manage this is to try and keep the worry at a time that is not when you are trying to sleep. And I know a lot of us sometimes feel like, We can't control our worry. So we sometimes recommend something called worry time for this. And to do this, what you want to do is set aside 15 to 30 minutes every day, not before bedtime. And during this time, you write down all of the worries you can think of. And then outside of that time, like if you're trying to fall asleep, you just remind yourself, I have a time to do this. And I'm not going to think about this until then. Maybe I write it down on a scrap of paper so I remember to look at it during my next worry time. But otherwise, any worries that pop up, I'm telling myself they have to wait until my next scheduled worry time. And the benefit of this is that it can help you control and compartmentalize your worries so it's not happening all the time, or it's not happening when you're trying to fall asleep. And it's a way to help limit your worries to daytime. All right. And to be clear, the goal of this is not necessarily to work through your worries, but sometimes writing them down as part of your worry time can help you sort of gain some clarity on things that you might not be able to think through so clearly as you're trying to fall asleep, because our brains just aren't working quite as well when we're tired. All right. So just kind of a summary of the things that we've gone through, because there have been a lot. Conditioning related recommendations would be to develop a good bedtime routine, keep a regular sleep schedule, get out of bed if you can't sleep. Things you want to stay away from before or during bedtime would be caffeine, alcohol, nicotine, screens. You want to make sure that your environment is comfortable, cool, quiet, dark, pet-free, all of those things. And then some other kind of miscellaneous recommendations would be avoid naps, exercise regularly but not too late, be mindful of when you eat, and then practice these relaxation exercises or anything else that is calming and relaxing for you at night. Some other thoughts on this. So first of all, as I kind of mentioned earlier, consistency is really key. These tips are really unlikely to work if you just do them once or twice. But what we know is that they're really, really effective if you practice them habitually. As I said, this is one of my favorite things to talk about with people because you can get so much, it's so rewarding to just make these small changes, do them consistently, and then find that your sleep is a lot better. The other thing to keep in mind is that of all of the things that we've talked about, you're probably going to find that some of these impact your sleep more than others. And if you're trying to make a really big change in your sleep, I would recommend maybe using something like a sleep diary, and you can Google those, there are plenty around. But it'll help you kind of see patterns in your sleep, and you might be able to see, well, you know, when I made this change, here's what's happened with my sleep. When I made this change, here's what happened. So that can be a good way to just kind of be aware of what's going on with your sleep. Times to consider seeing a professional. So we have talked so far about a lot of things that you can do just on your own. But if you're having sleep problems that are either chronic or they're really impairing, it might be time to talk to somebody who can help you with these. I will certainly throw out a plug for going to therapy to talk about sleep and the ways that therapy can help. There is a therapy called Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Insomnia, or CBTI, that is specifically geared towards helping people get their sleep in better shape. It includes some of the things we talked about today, but then some additional stuff on top of that. And also therapy can help people deal with anxiety, stress, mood concerns that might be interfering with their sleep. Of course, another thing that I would recommend if you're having a lot of trouble with sleep would be to go see your doctor. They can do a medical workup and tell you, do you have sleep apnea, or do they need to refer you, to get a sleep study? Could something be wrong with your thyroid? There are medical concerns that could be contributing to people's poor sleep sometimes. And of course, they can also talk to you about whether medications for your sleep would be appropriate. All right, and as I said, these links, since you can't click them, these are all things that I have links to that I wanted to share. And so those either are in the chat or they will be. And now we have a few minutes left, and I figured I will answer any questions that people have. And you can either I think you may be able to unmute yourself if you want to ask me a question, or you can send a message in the chat, which I will open back up so I can see it. And there are the links there. Okay. I see a question about how do you know if you're getting too much sleep, and are there problems associated with too much sleep? Yes. So I think gauging whether or not you're getting too much sleep can be a little bit tricky. Sometimes people might find that they need extra sleep because they're really stressed out and they're getting kind of exhausted from that and they need more sleep. The biggest problem that I think of when I think of people getting too much sleep is that their sleep starts to get what we call inefficient, meaning that of the amount of time that you spend in bed, you're not spending enough of it asleep. And so often that's what happens when people are spending a lot of time in bed is they're not actually sleeping for a lot of that time, they're waking up a lot. And they're kind of not going in and out of those cycles of sleep that we would expect to see with someone who has more normal sleep. Again, I think the signs of too much sleep and like how to know if you're there are probably different for every person. But, if it's the kind of thing where you are getting what you think is a full night's sleep, but you're having trouble getting up the next morning to go to work, or when you do get up, you don't feel fully awake, that could be a sign that either you're sleeping a little too much or a sign that your sleep while it's happening isn't as good. I hope that answered that. I think there are a lot of different possible answers to that question. All right. What else can I answer for anybody?
If folks have any other questions after this presentation, please know that you can reach out to us. You can reach out to Learning and Talent Development conferences as well. And we are happy to get and field those questions back to Kathleen. But with that, Kathleen, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to everyone as well who made time for this call. We wish you all a great rest of your Monday, and hopefully you're able to join some of the sessions later this week as well. Please check out the website if you have any questions or are looking for more information. We'll be hanging around on the line for just a little bit longer in case anyone does have additional questions, but feel free to drop off.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for coming. I appreciate it. And I did see, as we were talking there, I saw a question come in about melatonin. Melatonin is something that a lot of people take. I'm not a medical provider, so I hesitate to make any recommendations for that. I think it's something that can work really well for some people, doesn't seem to work at all for others. And so I would recommend talking to your doctor about that if you're wondering about that, because they could also tell you if they know, they're familiar with your health, and they could also talk to you about whether or not that's something they would recommend. But that is something a lot of people take to try and help with sleep. Yeah, so that's a good question too. Christine asked, I talked about carbs before bed, and she finds that sugar makes it harder to sleep. And is that a thing for others? It probably is. I think a lot of the things that I talked about today are not necessarily hard and fast rules for everybody. And so I think there are some people who may find that sugar is sort of activating for them. And so it's all about kind of figuring out how your body reacts to things. And if your body does not respond well to a little carb snack before bed, then I would recommend eating something else. These are all really good questions, by the way. Thank you all so much.